is Jackson Caranda, and for my final macroeconomics project, I will be doing fiscal policy and how it is used to impact the economy as a whole. What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the usage of government spending or taxation to influence the economy, but more specifically, how the government can impact aggregate demand and its components, which are GDP, unemployment, and price level or inflation. They use this to try and maintain price level stability and full employment within the economy. Fiscal policy can either have a direct or indirect impact on aggregate demand. It can have a direct impact by increasing or decreasing government spending as it is a component of aggregate demand, shown in the expenditures approach equation in the bottom right, as all four of those variables have an impact on GDP, and by changing G, that directly affects GDP, which directly affects aggregate demand. Indirect shows that there are changes to transfer payments or tax revenue as that impacts disposable income. The government can affect the aggregate demand curve by using fiscal policy for either the expansionary gap and recessionary gap. And there are different types of fiscal policy used for different types of gaps. Discuss the different types of fiscal policy, or some of the different types, discretionary versus non-discretionary. So discretionary is direct, deliberate actions taken by policymakers to adjust spending or taxes. It requires government actions and that government could pass legislation to increase spending and decrease taxes to stimulate the economy, or vice versa, and I will touch on that on the following slide. Now, non-discretionary fiscal policy, or also referred to as automatic stabilizers, are policies already built into the system that automatically adjust in response to economic changes. For example, if there's an economic downturn, tax payments would automatically decline and transfer payments would automatically increase due to there already being policies built in for them to adjust. Now, the opposite effects would happen if there's an economic boom. Some examples of this include a progressive tax system. With the more progressive the system, the larger the degree of stabilizers. And then an example of real GDP decreasing or a recession, some of these programs such as unemployment insurance, Medicaid or SNAP or Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, more people become eligible for them as the laws are already built in to do so. The slide before talking about discretionary fiscal policy, one example of that is expansionary fiscal policy, where we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right in order to readjust real GDP, unemployment, and price level. This is an example of discretionary fiscal policy as it is deliberate actions taken by the government to adjust spending and taxes. Now, when an expansionary fiscal policy occurs, there is a recessionary gap within the economy, which means real GDP is down, unemployment is up, and price level is down. In order to fix this, there needs to be an increase of government purchases of goods and service, along with an increase of government transfers and a decrease in taxes. And the goal of those three components is to get real GDP back to its level of 2.3%, unemployment to 4%, and price level back to its level of 2%. Example of discretionary fiscal policy is contractionary fiscal policy, which yet again is deliberate actions taken by the government to adjust for spending and taxes. Now, this happens when the economy has an inflationary gap, when real GDP is up, unemployment is down, and price level is up. And in order to fix this, there needs to be a decrease in government purchases of goods and services, along with a reduction of government transfers and an increase in taxes. And the same goal as before in the expansionary fiscal policy, it's to get real GDP back to 2.3%, unemployment back to 4%, and price level back to 2%. Other factors that impact fiscal policy or how fiscal policy can shift the aggregate demand curve. One of those is the multiplier effect, which determines the total shift of the aggregate demand curve when it shifts either left or right. And the total shift of the aggregate demand curve comes after the multiplier. The initial change in spending and taxes has a cumulative effect on GDP and it is exemplified by how much the multiplier affects it. And it determines how much the government should increase or decrease either spending or taxes. Now, the spending multiplier, you see the equation right there, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or 1 over the marginal propensity to save. And the tax multiplier, it is the marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or the marginal propensity to consume over the marginal propensity to save. It is always one less than the spending multiplier, as some proportion of the reduction of taxes or a tax cut will be saved. And by using this effect to impact the economic output, fiscal policy can influence the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions about whether or not interest rates should go up or down in the economy. Factor of fiscal policy is what is known as the crowding out effect. So an example of this would be a decline in real GDP or a recessionary gap where unemployment is rising, real GDP is down, and there's no pressure on the price level, but if it's a recessionary gap, that means it's declining. So that means that the government must implement expansionary fiscal policy in order to fix the aggregate demand curve, which means an increase in government spending and a reduction in taxes. This then leads to a larger federal budget deficit, and the government increases the demand for money, which then increases the interest rates. These higher interest rates then crowd out investment spending and leads to a decrease in private sector activity, which is seen more as a criticism of fiscal policy rather than a benefit for it. I'll touch on some examples of fiscal policy that can be seen within the real world today. In the article titled "Economists Are Rethinking Fiscal Policy," published by The Economist in 2019, this article explores how mainstream economic thinking on fiscal policy is shifting. Economists are now challenging traditional views that the government debt should always be minimized. They argue that because interest rates are low and likely to remain so at the time, high public debt levels may not be as damaging as previously thought. And the article also critiques the idea that debt crowds out private investment, touching on the crowding out effect, noting that investment remains strong and borrowing costs are low. And some key points that I took away about fiscal policy were this article advocates that more active use of fiscal policy during economic stability, such as combating deficits and debt and not doing it only during economic downturns. It suggests that sustained deficits may be justified if economic growth exceeds interest rates. And it also counters traditional approaches, especially given low inflation and interest rates. Another example of fiscal policy within the real world comes a year after The Economist's first article, with the Wall Street Journal article titled "U.S. Budget Gap Tripled to Record $3.1 Trillion in Fiscal 2020," and this was published after the COVID-19 pandemic first happened. This article details the U.S. government's record-breaking budget deficit in the fiscal year 2020 as a direct response to the COVID-19 crisis. Spending increased by 47%, mainly due to the CARES Act, while revenues fell due to the economic slowdown. Economists and institutions like the IMF supported continued deficit spending to support recovery. And some key fiscal policy points that I came across were that the article describes fiscal expansion via stimulus checks, business loans, and unemployment benefits, and notes that the deficit reached 16.1% of GDP, the highest it's been since World War II. And it shows that despite the deficit, interest rates remained low and inflation was muted, indicating that there was fiscal space within the economy. Another article that details an example of fiscal policy within the real world was published a year after the Wall Street Journal article, titled "Has the Pandemic Shown Inflation to be a Fiscal Phenomenon?" This article explains how the large-scale fiscal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, around $10.8 trillion globally, may have caused a spike in inflation, contrary to the previous decade where quantitative easing failed to do so. It compares the effects of the fiscal stimulus with quantitative easing and considers whether inflation is more of a result of fiscal actions rather than monetary ones. Some key fiscal policy points that I found were that this article highlights massive fiscal stimulus through direct cash transfers, business aid, the stimulus checks that the U.S. received as the main driver of pandemic-era inflation. And it also suggests that fiscal spending boosted demand by improving household balance sheets, and it supports the view that fiscal actions or government deficits may have more inflationary impact than quantitative easing when rates are near zero. And overall, these three articles show that there is a shift in attitude. Economists are increasingly accepting deficit spending as a legitimate tool, not just in recessions, but during stable periods when rates are low. Pandemic response, the COVID-19 crisis demonstrated the potency of fiscal policy in driving both recovery and inflation, and that monetary limits with interest rates near zero, fiscal policy is seen as more effective than monetary policy in boosting aggregate demand. Sources, I use parts of the chapter 13 macro PowerPoint we went over in class, and then the 3 articles that I discussed previously.